dawn on the sapphire shores of Dubrovnik. A millionaire's wife vanishes from her morning swim, her priceless jewels torn from her throat. Miss Jane Marple, knitting quietly on the terrace, notices one sapphire left behind like a taunt. Greed, betrayal, a secret insurance clause, and a lover's hidden map lead to a midnight confession. But the sea keeps one final secret, and only the tide will reveal who struck the fatal blow. Chapter 1. The Sapphire Invitation. The motor launch cut a neat white furrow through the Adriatic as it approached the private jetty of Sapphire Shores. Miss Jane Marple, seated amidships with her small leather suitcase at her feet, adjusted the brim of her straw hat against the spray. She was not by habit a traveller. The furthest she had ventured in recent years was the annual charabanc outing to the Isle of Wight. Yet here she was, at 70-odd, bound for the Dalmatian coast at the urgent behest of Mrs. Arabella Spence. Mrs. Spence's letter had arrived 3 weeks earlier, written in a sprawling hand on thick azure paper. "Dearest Jane, I am positively perishing of boredom among these marble corridors. Do come and bring your knitting, and that disconcerting way you have of seeing straight through people. The house is full, the sea is blue, and I promise you a mystery worthy of your talents. Ever your Arabella." Miss Marple had hesitated only long enough to consult her nephew Raymond, who assured her that Dubrovnik in September was quite civilized, and that Mrs. Spence's late husband had left her pots of money. Thus reassured, she had packed 2 cardigans, her copy of the Rubaiyat for the train, and a ball of pale blue wool. The launch bumped gently against the jetty. A young man in a white uniform sprang ashore to secure the painter, then offered Miss Marple a gloved hand. She accepted it with the dignity of one who has climbed many a stile in her time. The path upward was steep, terraced with oleander and punctuated by stone urns overflowing with scarlet geraniums. At the summit stood the villa, pale gold walls, green shutters, a loggia supported by slender columns that might have been lifted from a doge's palace. Beyond it, the sea dropped away in a dazzle of sapphire and turquoise. Mrs. Spence awaited her on the upper terrace, vast in mauve chiffon and pearls. "Jane, you angel!" She enveloped Miss Marple in a cloud of l'heure bleue and orange blossom. "You look exactly the same, only thinner, which is infuriating. Come, let me present the company before they devour all the iced coffee." The guests were assembled beneath a striped awning. Colonel Bantry, red-faced, moustached, and already perspiring into his linen suit, rose with military promptitude. "Delighted, ma'am. Served with your brother in '09, you know." Miss Marple murmured something polite. She had no brother. Mr. Lucian Gale, the artist, lounged in a wicker chair, a cigarette dangling from one long finger. He was dark, thin, and handsome in the Byronic manner, with a lock of hair that fell continually into his eyes. He greeted Miss Marple with a lazy smile that did not quite reach those eyes. Miss Drusilla Fairfax sat a little apart, her steel needles flashing through an indeterminate garment in shades of sludge and bile. She was tall, angular, and dressed in the sort of beige that suggests a lifetime of committee meetings. "How do you do?" she said without looking up. "I hope you're not allergic to cats. Mrs. Spence keeps 3 Persians who consider the furniture their personal domain." The Americans, Mr. and Mrs. Harlan P. Croft, occupied a sofa as though it were a throne. Mrs. Croft was a vision in white pique, her blonde hair coiled beneath a picture hat. At her throat and ears blazed the sapphires, deep, cold, and flawless. The necklace was a collar of graduated stones, the earrings teardrops the size of hazelnuts, the brooch a dolphin en cabochon, its eye a single diamond. Mr. Croft, florid and prosperous, patted his wife's hand with proprietary pride. "My little girl likes her baubles," he boomed. "Cost me a pretty penny, but worth every cent to see 'em on her." Mrs. Spence clapped her hands. "Now luncheon. We dine on the lower terrace tonight. Candlelight, lobsters, and a string quartet from the town. Jane, you shall sit between the Colonel and Mr. Gale. I warn you, the Colonel talks of nothing but tigers, and Mr. Gale of nothing at all." Miss Marple allowed herself to be led indoors. The hall was cool, floored in black and white marble, scented faintly with beeswax and the sea. A maid in a starched apron conducted her to a bedroom overlooking the cove. White walls, a vast bed draped in mosquito netting, a balcony where bougainvillea spilled like purple ink. On the dressing table lay a single white rose and a card. "Welcome to Sapphire Shores. A.S." She unpacked with methodical care. Nightgown, slippers, the blue wool, a small leather-bound notebook in which she sometimes jotted observations. From the balcony, she could see the entire sweep of the terrace below, the jetty, and beyond, the old town of Dubrovnik clustered like a handful of coral on the shore. A yacht flying the stars and stripes lay at anchor. Nearer in, a fisherman mended nets on the rocks. Everything was very quiet except for the cicadas and the soft slap of water against stone. At 4 o'clock she descended for tea. The company had reassembled, augmented by a young woman Miss Marple had not yet met. Mrs. Spence's secretary, Miss Leonora Gray, neat in navy linen, with a stenographer's pad perpetually at the ready. Tea was served in Sèvres cups. The sandwiches were thin and curled at the edges. The cake, a Dalmatian almond torta, proved unexpectedly delicious. Conversation drifted like thistledown. Colonel Bantry recounted the demise of a man-eater in the central provinces. Mrs. Croft admired the view and wondered aloud whether the sapphires would show up against candlelight. Mr. Gale sketched idly on the tablecloth. Miss Marple noted that the profile emerging beneath his pencil was unmistakably Mrs. Croft's, though the mouth was set in a harder line than nature allowed. Miss Fairfax knitted. Mr. Croft discussed exchange rates. Mrs. Spence fluttered and exclaimed. Miss Marple sipped her tea and observed. She observed that Mrs. Croft touched the sapphire necklace whenever her husband's attention wandered. She observed that Mr. Gale's eyes followed the movement with the fixity of a cat watching cream. She observed that Miss Fairfax's needles hesitated whenever Mrs. Croft laughed. A high metallic sound that carried across the water like a cracked bell. And she observed, though no one else appeared to, that the dolphin brooch on Mrs. Croft's shoulder was fastened with a safety chain so fine it might have been a thread of spider silk. When the sun began to sink, painting the sea in molten copper, Mrs. Spence rose. "We dress for dinner at 8. Jane, do wear your grey lace. I remember it from that dreadful bazaar in 23. It becomes you." Miss Marple smiled. "I shall do my best not to disgrace you, Arabella." As she climbed the stairs to her room, she paused on the landing. From the window she could see the lower terrace being prepared. White cloths, silver candelabra, a small orchestra tuning beneath the pergola. The sapphires would indeed show up against candlelight. They would blaze like drops of frozen night. She entered her room, closed the shutters against the dying sun, and sat for a moment on the edge of the bed. In the hush, she could hear the sea breathing below, steady and patient. Such a beautiful place, she murmured to the empty air, and such very dangerous jewels. Chapter 2. The Whisper of the Waves. Miss Marple was not a sound sleeper. In her little cottage at home, she woke at the least creak of a floorboard, or the distant bark of a dog. Here, in the vast bed at Sapphire Shores, the silence itself was unsettling. The mosquito netting hung like a bridal veil, and the air was heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine that drifted up from the terrace below. She lay for some time listening to the hush, then to the faint rhythmic slap of water against the rocks far beneath her balcony. At length she rose, slipped her feet into quilted slippers, and drew on the pale blue woolen dressing gown she had knitted herself the previous winter. The house was dark, but not entirely so. A lamp burned low in the corridor, and the great staircase curved downward like the inside of a nautilus shell. Its marble steps cool beneath her hand. She moved with the caution of one who has learned that midnight wanderings are best conducted in silence. At the foot of the stairs she paused. A door stood ajar, the door to the library, she thought, and from within came the scratch of a match. Someone else was wakeful. She hesitated, then continued on, her way. The French windows to the lower terrace had been left unlatched. A ribbon of warmer air curled in, carrying the salt breath of the sea. Miss Marple stepped outside. The night was luminous. A 3/4 moon rode high above the old town, silvering the terraced roofs and the masts of the fishing boats in the harbour. The terrace itself was a chessboard of light and shadow, the awning stripes thrown into sharp relief. The tables had been cleared, the chairs pushed back, but the candelabra still stood in a silent row, their wax pooled like pale blood. Beyond the balustrade, the sea stretched away black and glittering to the faint smudge of the islands. A figure stood at the far end, leaning on the stone parapet. It was Lucian Gale. He had discarded his dinner jacket. The white shirt open at the throat caught the moonlight like a flag of truce. In one hand he held a cigarette, its tip glowing, in the other a sketchbook. He was drawing rapidly, the pencil a pale blur against the page. Miss Marple advanced softly. The tiles were still warm from the day's sun. She was within 6 feet of him before he sensed her presence and turned. "Miss Marple?" His voice was low, amused, a little startled. "I might have known the quietest feet in the house would belong to you." "I might say the same of your pencil," she replied. "It makes no sound at all, yet it disturbs the night." He laughed under his breath and closed the book. "Insomnia, the curse of the idle, and you." "The air is close," she said. "In my village the nights are cooler, even in summer. Here the sea seems to hold a heat like a grudge." Gale drew on his cigarette. The smoke drifted away toward the water. "You don't care for the sea." "I respect it," Miss Marple corrected gently. "It gives and it takes with equal indifference, rather like certain people one meets at house parties." He glanced at her sharply, then away. "You have a disconcerting habit of saying more than you seem to, Miss Marple." "That is because I have lived a long time," she said, "and observed a great deal. For instance, I observe that you draw Mrs. Croft's profile with considerable accuracy, yet you alter the set of her mouth. Why is that, Mr. Gale?" He was silent for a moment. "Then an artist sees what others miss, or perhaps what he fears to see plainly. Fear is an interesting word, Miss Marple murmured. She moved to the balustrade and rested her hands upon the warm stone. Below, the private cove lay in shadow, a narrow crescent of shingle cupped between two arms of rock. A flight of steps, zigzagging like a lightning bolt, descended from the terrace to the water's edge. Tell me, do many of the guests swim at night? Mrs. Croft does sometimes. She says the water is warmer after dark. Gale flicked ash into the void. Harlan disapproves. He says it's asking for trouble. Sharks, currents, God knows what. But she laughs at him. She laughs at most things. Miss Marple's eyes, mild behind their spectacles, rested on the sapphire-coloured sea. And the sapphires? Does she laugh at those? Gale gave a short, humourless laugh. She wears them as a queen wears a crown. They are her signature, her armour, her advertisement. Harlan bought them in Antwerp last year. £50,000 or so the gossip goes. Insured, of course, but insurance is a cold comfort when the stones are on your throat. £50,000, Miss Marple repeated softly. A great deal of money. Enough to buy freedom, perhaps, for someone who felt trapped. Gale turned to face her fully. The moonlight carved hollows beneath his cheekbones. You think someone here is trapped? I think, said Miss Marple, that every house party is a little cage. We bring our bars with us, debts, secrets, longings. The sea is very large, Mr. Gale. It makes the cage seem smaller. He stared at her for a long moment, then opened the sketchbook again. With a few swift strokes, he added something to the drawing he had been working on. He tore out the page and handed it to her. It was Mrs. Croft, unmistakably, but the sapphires at her throat had become a noose of blue fire, and her eyes were wide with terror. Artistic license, he said, but his voice was unsteady. Miss Marple folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her dressing gown. Art is often truth in disguise, she said. Good night, Mr. Gale. She left him there, a dark figure against the silvered sea, and retraced her steps across the terrace. As she passed the candelabra, she noticed that one of the candles had burned lower than the rest. Its wick had drowned in a pool of wax, and the flame had gone out. A thin ribbon of smoke curled upward, acrid and brief. Inside, the house was still. She paused at the foot of the staircase. From the upper landing came the faint creak of a door, someone else moving in the dark. She waited, but no footsteps followed. After a moment, she continued upward, her hand light on the banister. Her room was as she had left it, the bed turned down, the mosquito netting a pale cloud. She placed Gale's drawing on the dressing table beside her notebook, then opened the balcony doors. The jasmine was stronger now, almost cloying. Far below, the cove lay in darkness, but she thought she saw a flicker of movement on the steps. A white shape, gone almost before it registered. She closed the doors, drew the curtains, and sat for a while in the wicker chair by the window. The sketch lay where she had left it, the sapphire noose gleaming even in the dimness. She took up her knitting, 4 rows of plain, 4 of pearl, and let the needles click softly in the quiet. At some point she must have dozed, for she woke with a start to find the moon lower in the sky, and the house utterly silent. The knitting had slipped from her lap. She retrieved it, smoothed the wool, and rose to draw, back the curtain a fraction. The terrace was empty. The sea had withdrawn, leaving the shingle wet and shining. On the lowest step of the zigzag path, lay something pale, a towel perhaps, or a discarded garment. It had not been there earlier. Miss Marple stood watching until the moon slipped behind a cloud, and the cove was swallowed by shadow. Then she returned to bed, but not to sleep. She lay listening to the whisper of the waves, steady as a pulse, and thought of sapphires and nooses, and the thin line between laughter and terror. Outside, the night held its breath. Chapter 3. The Morning. After the first hint that something was amiss came with the coffee, Miss Marple descended at 8:30, drawn by the aroma of freshly ground beans and the distant clatter of china. The breakfast room opened onto the upper terrace. Sunlight poured through the arches in bright slanting bars, gilding the silver chafing dishes and the white damask cloth. Mrs. Spence was already enthroned at the head of the table, presiding over a battalion of toast racks and marmalade pots. Colonel Bantry stood by the sideboard, helping himself to kidneys with the solemnity of a man performing a sacred rite. Miss Fairfax sat opposite, knitting needles poised above a half-finished sleeve in a particularly virulent shade of mustard. Mr. Gale was absent, so conspicuously were the Crofts. "Harlan telephoned down," Mrs. Spence announced, waving a triangle of toast like a semaphore flag. "Evelyn went for her usual swim at dawn. She'll be up presently, ravenous and cross because the water was colder than she expected. Jane, do try the fig jam. It's from the tree by the gate." Miss Marple accepted a cup of coffee, strong, black, and excellent, and took her place beside Miss Grey, the secretary, who was making neat entries in a leather-bound ledger. The girl's pen moved with mechanical precision. She did not look up. "Mrs. Croft is punctual, I take it?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. "Like the tide," Mrs. Spence replied. "She appears at 9:15 precisely, wrapped in a towel the size of a circus tent, demanding poached eggs and gossip. Harlan trails behind, grumbling about sharks." Colonel Bantry snorted. "Sharks? Poppycock! The Adriatic's as tame as a goldfish bowl. Still, can't blame a fellow for worrying. Those sapphires, begging your pardon, ma'am, make a tempting bait." Miss Fairfax gave a small, disapproving cough. "Jewels are a vanity," she observed, without raising her eyes from her knitting. "Vanity goeth before a fall." The clock on the mantel struck 9. No Mrs. Croft. At 1:15, Harlan Croft appeared alone. He was dressed for the beach, white flannels, a striped blazer, a Panama hat clutched in one hand, but his face was the colour of wet parchment. He stood in the doorway as though uncertain of his welcome. "Evelyn's not back," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. Mrs. Spence's toast halted halfway to her mouth. "Not back, but she never swims more than 20 minutes. "She left the house at 6:30, Croft continued. He seemed to be addressing the carpet. "I was awake, heard her on the stairs, thought nothing of it. When I came down at 8, her towel was gone, but the sapphires were still on the dressing table. I assumed she'd put them away." He swallowed. "They're gone too." A small collective intake of breath rippled around the table. Miss Marple set down her cup with care. "Gone?" echoed Mrs. Spence. "All of them?" Croft nodded. "Necklace, earrings, brooch. The safe in our room is open, combination lock. Only Evelyn and I knew the numbers." Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "Look here, old man, no need to jump to conclusions. Probably took 'em down to the cove herself. Some women like to wear their trinkets everywhere. Dashed unsafe, but there it is." Croft shook his head. She never wore them swimming. Said the salt dulled the stones. Miss Grey closed her ledger with a soft snap. "I'll telephone the harbour master," she said briskly. "Perhaps someone saw her from a boat." She rose and crossed to the instrument on the side table. The room fell silent, except for the click of Miss Fairfax's needles and the distant cry of gulls. Miss Marple buttered a second piece of toast she did not want, and observed Mr. Croft. He had sunk into a chair, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief that trembled in his grasp. His eyes, pale blue and slightly protuberant, darted from face to face as though seeking an ally. At 9:45, the maid, a plump girl named Anna, appeared in the doorway wringing her apron. She addressed Mrs. Spence in rapid Croatian. Miss Grey translated in a low voice. "Anna says Madame's evening gown is laid across the chair in her room, exactly as she left it last night. The sapphire necklace is on the dressing table, coiled like a snake. But the earrings and the dolphin brooch are missing, and there is sand on the carpet, wet sand." Croft started up. "Sand? Then she did come back?" "Or someone carried it in," Miss Marple said quietly. The words fell into the room like a pebble into a pond. Mrs. Spence's hand flew to her pearls. Colonel Bantry's moustache bristled. Miss Fairfax's needles paused mid-stitch. At 10 o'clock, Inspector Luca Varga arrived. He was a slight man, in a well-cut grey suit, with the mournful eyes of a poet and the manners of a diplomat. He apologized for the intrusion, accepted a cup of coffee he did not drink, and requested that the entire household remain within call. Then he and Croft disappeared upstairs. The morning dragged. The sun climbed higher, turning the terrace into a furnace. Mrs. Spence retired to her boudoir with a headache and a bottle of eau de cologne. Colonel Bantry paced the loggia, muttering about Dago police and native inefficiency. Miss Fairfax knitted with redoubled vigour. The mustard sleeve grew by several inches. Mr. Gale had not appeared at all. Miss Marple slipped away to the library. It was a long, cool room, lined with unread leather-bound volumes and smelling faintly of cigars. French windows opened onto a side terrace, shaded by a pergola of vines. She seated herself in a deep armchair, took out her knitting, and waited. At 11:30, Inspector Varga returned. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, and addressed the company with grave courtesy. "Mrs. Croft's footprints lead from the villa steps to the water's edge," he said. "They are clear in the damp sand. There are no returning prints. The tide has not yet reached that part of the cove. We are dragging the shallows now." Croft made a choking sound. "You think she drowned?" "It is possible," Varga replied. "Or she swam out and was taken by cramp. The current here is treacherous. We will know more when the men have finished." He hesitated, then added, "The safe was opened with the correct combination. Whoever took the earrings and the brooch knew it, or persuaded Mrs. Croft to open it for them." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "And the necklace? Why leave that behind?" Varga's dark eyes met hers. "An excellent question, madame. Perhaps the thief was interrupted. Perhaps the necklace was too heavy to carry in haste. Or perhaps—" He shrugged, a small, eloquent gesture. Colonel Bantry exploded. "Dashed if I'll sit here twiddling my thumbs. I'll take my service revolver and search the grounds myself." Varga bowed. "As you wish, Colonel, but please touch nothing." The Colonel stumped off. Miss Fairfax gathered her wool and departed with the air of one escaping a plague. Mrs. Spence's maid appeared to announce that her mistress was prostrate and would receive no one. Croft wandered out onto the terrace and stood staring at the sea as though it might give up its secret if stared at long enough. Miss Marple remained where she was. After a moment, Inspector Varga crossed the room and took the chair opposite her. "You are Miss Jane Marple," he said. "It was not a question. I am. I have read of you in the English papers. You interest yourself in crime." "I interest myself in people," she corrected gently. "Crime is merely what happens when people interest themselves too much in the wrong things." Varga smiled faintly. "Then perhaps you will walk with me to the cove. I value a second pair of eyes, especially eyes that see what others miss." Miss Marple laid aside her knitting. "I should be delighted, Inspector." They descended the zigzag steps together. The sun beat down. Heat shimmered above the rocks. Halfway down, they met the search party returning. 4 policemen in shirt-sleeves, dripping with sweat, carrying a stretcher covered by a tarpaulin. Croft followed at a distance, his Panama hat clutched to his chest. Varga lifted the corner of the tarpaulin. "Mrs." Croft lay as though asleep, her blonde hair dark with water, her face composed. The white bathing costume was torn at the shoulder. A livid bruise marred the temple. The sapphires were gone. "Dead less than 3 hours, Varga said quietly. "The doctor will confirm. Death by drowning, but the blow came first." Miss Marple looked at the bruise, then at the rocks above. "She was struck from behind," she murmured, "and pushed. The tide did the rest." Varga replaced the tarpaulin. "You are very certain, madame?" "I have seen violence before," Miss Marple said. "It leaves a signature, like a faulty knitting stitch. One learns to recognize the pattern." They stood in silence as the stretcher was carried upward. Far above on the terrace, a figure watched, tall, dark, motionless. Lucian Gale. Miss Marple shaded her eyes. "Tell me, Inspector, did Mrs. Croft have any enemies?" Varga's smile was wintry. "In my experience, madame, a woman who wears £50,000 around her neck collects enemies the way a ship collects barnacles." "Quite," said Miss Marple, "but barnacles do not usually commit murder. They merely slow the vessel down." She turned and began the long climb back to the villa, her mind busy with footprints that ended at the water's edge, with sapphires left behind like a taunt, and with the faint, almost imperceptible scent of jasmine that had clung to the dead woman's hair. Chapter 4. The Tide Reveals. The body was carried up the zigzag path on a makeshift stretcher of oars and sailcloth. Miss Marple followed at a measured pace, her straw hat tilted against the sun, her thoughts moving with the precision of a watchmaker's tweezers. Inspector Varga walked beside her, silent now, his earlier courtesy replaced by the absorbed concentration of a man assembling a puzzle in his head. Behind them, Harlan Croft stumbled like a drunken man, his Panama hat lost somewhere on the rocks, his shirt plastered to his back with sweat and seawater. At the villa, the stretcher was laid on the lower terrace, while Anna fetched a sheet to cover it. Mrs. Spence, revived by sal volatile and curiosity, appeared in the doorway wrapped in a peach negligée. Her face blanched beneath its powder. "Is it?" she began, then pressed a hand to her mouth. Varga nodded. "Yes, madame, I regret." Croft sank onto a stone bench and buried his face in his hands. Colonel Bantry, who had returned from his fruitless patrol of the grounds, stood stiffly to attention, as though at a military funeral. Miss Fairfax hovered on the threshold, clutching her knitting bag like a shield. Lucian Gale was nowhere to be seen. Varga issued quiet instructions. The body was to be removed to the mortuary in the town. The cove would be searched again at low tide. The guests were requested, politely but firmly, to remain within the villa grounds until further notice. Then he turned to Miss Marple. "Will you walk with me once more, Madame? The tide is falling. There may be something the water has left behind." They descended again. The sun was past its zenith now, and the rocks cast sharp, inky shadows. The policemen had roped off the cove with twine and were combing the shingle methodically, heads bent, boots crunching. A photographer from the local paper had arrived and was being firmly dissuaded by a uniformed sergeant. Varga led Miss Marple to the spot where the footprints ended. The sand was drying rapidly, the impressions shallow but distinct. A woman's narrow foot, the print of a bathing sandal with a diagonal strap. They stopped abruptly at the waterline, as though Mrs. Croft had stepped into the sea and been dissolved. "No sign of a struggle here," Varga observed. "The sand is smooth." "Yet the bruise was on the right temple," Miss Marple said. "A blow from behind, delivered by a right-handed person standing above her on the path. She would have fallen forward into the water." Varga's eyebrows rose. "You are precise." "One notices these things," Miss Marple said modestly. "In my village, Mrs. Pickens was struck by her husband with a flat iron. The angle was similar, though the weapon, of course, was different." They moved along the water's edge. The tide had retreated some 20 feet, exposing a narrow strip of wet sand and a tangle of seaweed. Something glinted among the rocks. A single sapphire earring, its platinum claw bent, the stone itself chipped at one corner as though it had been torn away by force. Varga picked it up with a handkerchief and held it to the light. "Torn from the ear," he said. "There will be blood, perhaps." Miss Marple peered at the surrounding rocks. "And there, see the smear? Quite fresh." A dark streak marred the pale limestone, no longer than a thumbprint. Varga signalled to the photographer, who came running with his cumbersome apparatus. While the man set up his tripod, Miss Marple continued her scrutiny. The rocks formed a natural funnel, as she had noted from the terrace. A body pushed from the path would slide inevitably downward, gathering speed until it struck the water with sufficient force to stun. The bruise on the temple might have been caused by the fall itself, or by the weapon that precipitated it. She straightened and shaded her eyes. High above, on the balustrade, a figure watched. Drusilla Fairfax, her beige dress fluttering like a surrender flag. She raised one hand, whether in greeting or warning was impossible to tell, then vanished indoors. Varga joined Miss Marple. "The earring will be photographed and bagged. The doctor says the skull is fractured. A single blow, heavy, delivered with something rounded, a stone perhaps, or the butt of a revolver." "Colonel Bantry has a revolver," Miss Marple remarked. Varga smiled thinly. "So he has informed me. 3 times it is a Webley, army issue, and has not been fired recently. Still, we keep it." She climbed back to the terrace. The sheeted form had been removed. Only a damp patch on the tiles remained. Anna was on her knees scrubbing with frantic energy, tears running down her cheeks. Croft had been taken indoors. Mrs. Spence sat in the drawing-room, with a brandy glass trembling in her hand. Miss Grey beside her taking dictation in a low, steady voice. Colonel Bantry paced the loggia, revolver bulging in his pocket. Lucian Gale had appeared at last. He stood at the balustrade sketching the cove with quick, angry strokes, his face set like a mask. Miss Marple paused beside him. "You draw very fast, Mr. Gale." "Memory," he said without looking up. "The scene changes. One must catch it before it lies." "Or before the police do," she said gently. He closed the sketchbook with a snap. "You think I killed her?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that you saw more than you admit. The drawing you gave me last night, the sapphires as a noose, was it prophecy or rehearsal?" His laugh was bitter. "You flatter me. I'm only an artist, not a murderer." "Artists," Miss Marple observed, "have been known to do both." She left him and entered the house. The hall was dim after the glare outside. The marble floor reflected the chandelier like a pool of dark water. She mounted the stairs slowly, pausing on the landing to study the Croft suite. The door stood open. A policeman guarded it. Inside, another officer was dusting the dressing table for fingerprints. The room was lavish. A canopied bed, silk hangings the colour of clotted cream, a chaise longue heaped with cushions. On the dressing table lay the sapphire necklace, coiled as Anna had described, its clasp unfastened. Beside it, a powder bowl overturned, its contents scattered like snow. The safe door gaped in the wall. Inside, velvet trays lay empty. Miss Marple's eye was caught by something on the carpet. A single grain of sand, larger than the rest, glistening with moisture. She bent and picked it up with a corner of her handkerchief. It was not sand at all, but a fragment of shell, pale pink, sharp-edged. She slipped it into her pocket and crossed to the window. From here the cove was visible in its entirety. The path, the rocks, the narrow beach. A fishing boat bobbed at anchor beyond the Hedgew land. Its occupant, an old man in a red cap, was mending nets with the patience of one who has all the time in the world. Downstairs, the telephone rang. Miss Gray's voice floated up the stairwell, calm and efficient. "Yes, Inspector, at once." Miss Marple descended. Varga was in the hall, receiver in hand. He replaced it and turned to her. "The doctor confirms death by drowning, but unconsciousness first. The blow was delivered with a stone. Traces of limestone in the wound. Time of death between 6 and 7 this morning." "And the missing jewels?" "Nothing yet. But the harbour master reports a motorboat left the bay at dawn. Fast, heading south. No passenger visible." Miss Marple considered. Mrs. Croft was a strong swimmer. According to her husband, yes. Olympic trials, 20 years ago. Then she did not drown by accident. Someone struck her, carried or dragged her to the water, and held her under until the sea finished the work. Varga's eyes narrowed. "You speak with certainty." "I have seen drowning before," Miss Marple said. "In the mill pond at home. A boy, foolish, quarrelsome. The bruises on the shoulders told the tale. Here, there will be bruises too, though the bathing costume hides them." Varga made a note. "We will look." They stepped out onto the terrace. The sun was lowering now, turning the sea to molten brass. The policemen had finished their search. One approached with a small canvas bag. "Only this, sir," he said in Croatian. Varga translated. "A lady's bathing cap snagged on the rocks, and a cigarette butt, Turkish, gold-tipped." Miss Marple recognized the brand. Lucian Gale smoked them. Varga pocketed the butt. "We will test for saliva, and the cap, Mrs. Croft's." "Monogram DC," the policeman confirmed. Miss Marple looked toward the cove. The tide had turned. Water crept inward, licking at the rocks, erasing the last traces of footprints. Soon the shingle would be smooth again. Innocent. She thought of the pink shell fragment in her pocket, of the earring torn away in violence, of the necklace left behind like a signature. Somewhere in this gilded cage of a villa, a murderer walked free, and the sea, patient as ever, kept its counsel. Varga offered his arm. "You are tired, madame. Let us go in. There will be questions, many questions." Miss Marple took the arm with a small, composed smile. "Questions are my métier, Inspector. It is the answers that sometimes disappoint." Chapter 5. The Weight of Jewels. The drawing-room at Sapphire Shores had never been designed for inquisition. Its walls, papered in pale gold silk, reflected the afternoon light in a flattering glow. Its chandeliers tinkled softly whenever a door opened. Its sofas were deep enough to swallow a duchess. Yet by 4 o'clock that day it had become a court of sorts, with Inspector Varga at the head of the long table, a sergeant at his elbow taking shorthand, and the household ranged along the sides like reluctant witnesses at a trial. Mrs. Spence had changed into black. A trifle theatrical, Miss Marple thought, but grief takes odd forms, and sat twisting a lace handkerchief into knots. Colonel Bantry stood behind her chair, rigid as a sentry. Harlan Croft occupied the far end, his collar unbuttoned, his eyes red-rimmed. Miss Fairfax knitted with mechanical fury. The mustard sleeve had become a scarf, then a muffler, then threatened to engulf the table entirely. Lucian Gale lounged against the mantelpiece, a cigarette smouldering between his fingers, his sketchbook nowhere in evidence. Miss Grey, neat as ever, had exchanged her ledger for a fresh notebook and sat ready to record every word. Varga began with courtesy. "I regret the necessity, but clarity is essential. Mrs. Croft was murdered between 6 and 7 this morning. The weapon was a stone, subsequently thrown into the sea. The sapphire earrings and dolphin brooch are missing. The necklace was found on the dressing table. Mr. Croft, you discovered the theft at what hour?" Croft passed a hand over his face. 8:15. I woke, reached for Evelyn. She wasn't beside me. Thought she'd gone swimming, as usual. Went to the dressing table for my cufflinks. The safe was open, the necklace lay there, but the rest, his voice cracked. I ran downstairs, asked Anna if Madame had returned. She hadn't. And the combination. Only Evelyn and I knew it. Birth dates, hers, mine, our wedding day. Varga made a note. "Colonel Bantry, you were awake early?" "Always am," the colonel barked. "Old habit. Heard the 6 o'clock bell from the town. Took a turn on the loggia with my coffee. Saw nothing. Mist over the water, devilish thick." "Miss Fairfax?" "I rise at 7, she said primly. I was in the breakfast room at 7:30. Mr. Croft came down at 8. Mr. Gale?" The artist shrugged. "I sleep badly. Was in the garden at dawn, sketching the light on the walls. Heard the splash of someone swimming. Thought it was Mrs. Croft. Paid no attention." Varga's eyes flicked to Miss Marple. She sat quietly, hands folded over her knitting bag, the very picture of elderly inconsequence. "And you, madam?" "I slept until 8, she said. "The sea air, you know. I came down for coffee at 8:30. Mr. Croft was already agitated." Varga turned back to Croft. "Your wife's bathing cap was found snagged on the rocks. Did she always wear one?" "Always. Said chlorine ruined her hair. Salt water worse. Monogrammed gold thread." "The cap was torn," Varga said, "as though snatched off in haste." Croft's hands clenched. "She'd have fought. Evelyn was no weakling." Miss Marple spoke for the first time. Yet the footprints show no struggle on the sand. The blow was delivered higher up the path, I think. She was stunned, carried or dragged the last few yards, and pushed into the water. The cap came off then. Silence greeted this. Mrs. Spence gave a stifled sob. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat noisily. Varga resumed. The missing jewels are insured for £50,000. The policy, Mr. Croft, contains an unusual clause. Croft started. How did you— Your London solicitors were most cooperative. In case of theft during travel, the claimant must prove the jewels were worn at the time of loss. Photographs, witnesses, or the jewels themselves recovered from the scene, otherwise no payment. Croft's face darkened. That's standard. Evelyn insisted on the clause. She said it discouraged carelessness or encouraged murder, Varga said softly. Croft half rose. See here. Sit down, sir. The inspector's voice was mild steel. Croft sat. Miss Grey leaned forward. Inspector, the motorboat that left at dawn. Could the thief have escaped by sea? Possible, but the boat was local, hired yesterday by a man giving the name Petrovich. Description vague. Dark coat, hat pulled low, paid in cash. Colonel Bantry snorted. Sounds like a professional jewel thief. Dash it, man, you're barking up the wrong tree questioning us. Varga ignored him. Miss Fairfax, you were seen on the terrace at 11 o'clock. Why? Miss Fairfax's needles faltered. I wished to see the cove. Morbid curiosity, perhaps. You dropped something, Miss Marple said quietly. A small object. It glinted. Miss Fairfax flushed. My thimble, sterling silver. It slipped from my finger. Varga made another note. We will look for it. The questioning continued. Times were established, alibis probed. No one had a convincing reason to be abroad between 6 and 7. No one had seen Mrs. Croft after she left her room. The Turkish cigarette butt found near the bathing cap was produced in a glass tube. Gale examined it without expression. Mine, I dare say. I smoked too many, must have dropped it earlier. Or later, Varga said. At 6 o'clock, the session ended. The guests dispersed like smoke. Mrs. Spence retired to lie down. Colonel Bantry marched off to clean his revolver. Miss Fairfax vanished with her knitting. Gale disappeared toward the garden. Croft remained at the table, staring at the coiled necklace, now lying in an evidence bag. Miss Marple lingered. Varga approached her. Your thoughts, madame? She considered. The necklace was left deliberately, a taunt or a mistake. The thief knew the safe's combination, therefore someone close to the Crofts. Yet the earrings and brooch were taken in haste, one torn from the ear. Passion, not calculation. And the wedding ring? Varga asked. The doctor found the mark on her finger, but the ring is gone. Gold with a single diamond. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. A curious theft. One does not strip a corpse for sentiment, unless, she paused, unless the ring identified something the killer wished to conceal. Varga's gaze sharpened. A lover. Or a debt, Miss Marple said. Jewels are currency, Inspector, so are promises. She opened her knitting bag and took out the pink shell fragment. Found on the carpet in Mrs. Croft's room. Not sand shell. From the cove, perhaps, carried in on a shoe. Varga turned it in his fingers. We will compare it with samples from the beach. Dinner that evening was a travesty. The string quartet had been dismissed. The lobsters returned to the kitchen untouched. The company picked at cold consommé and picked at one another. Mrs. Spence drank 3 glasses of hock and announced she would sell the villa. Colonel Bantry recounted the plot of a thriller he had read, in which the butler did it. Miss Fairfax knitted a knot so tight it had to be cut free with nail scissors. Gale drank brandy and stared at the candle flames until his eyes watered. Croft excused himself early, pleading a headache. Miss Marple ate sparingly and observed. She observed that Gale's hands shook when he lit his cigarette, that Miss Fairfax's ball of wool was nearly exhausted, that Croft, passing behind his wife's empty chair, touched the back of it as though expecting her to turn and scold him. At 10 o'clock the house settled into uneasy quiet. Miss Marple sat in her room with the balcony doors open to the night. The sea had risen again. Waves boomed softly against the rocks. She took out her notebook and wrote in her neat slanting hand, combination known to kill her. Blow from behind, right-handed, necklace left, why? Ring taken, why? Shell fragment, whose shoe? Motorboat, accomplice, or red herring? She underlined the last two words, then closed the book. From the corridor came the creak of a floorboard, someone moving stealthily. She rose and opened her door a crack. Lucian Gale stood outside the Croft suite, one hand raised as though to knock, the other clutching his sketchbook. He saw her, froze, then turned on his heel and vanished down the back stairs. Miss Marple closed the door softly. She did not return to bed. Instead, she sat by the window, knitting by moonlight, until the sky paled and the gulls began their raucous dawn chorus. Somewhere in the villa, a clock struck 4. The weight of the sapphires, she thought, had grown heavier than any woman could bear, and someone had decided to lighten the burden, permanently. Chapter 6. The pattern emerges. The telegram from London arrived at 9:30, delivered by a boy on a bicycle, who accepted a coin and a glass of water before pedalling away down the dusty road. Miss Grey brought it to the breakfast table, where the remnants of coffee and cold toast bore witness to another sleepless night. Inspector Varga slit the envelope with a fruit knife and read the flimsy sheet in silence. His eyebrows rose a fraction, the only sign of surprise he permitted himself. "From the insurers," he announced. "The Sapphire policy was altered 6 weeks ago. A new beneficiary was added. In the event of Mrs. Croft's death, the payout is to be divided equally between Mr. Croft and a Miss Drusilla Fairfax, described as cousin and companion." Miss Fairfax's needles clattered to the floor. The mustard muffler unravelled across the tiles like a yellow tongue. "Cousin," Mrs. Spence gasped. "Drusilla, you never said—" "I am a connection by marriage," Miss Fairfax said faintly. "Third cousin to Evelyn's first husband. We corresponded. She invited me here to discuss family matters." Croft's face had gone the colour of tallow. "Evelyn never mentioned any change. I swear it." Varga folded the telegram. The alteration was signed by Mrs. Croft in the presence of her London solicitor. The motive, it seems, becomes clearer. Colonel Bantry slapped at the table. "Motive be damned! You can't hang a fellow on a scrap of paper. Where's the proof?" "Proof," said Varga, "is what we're assembling, Colonel, brick by brick." Miss Marple buttered a corner of toast she had no intention of eating. "Bricks are excellent things, Inspector, provided one lays them in the right order. May I see the telegram?" Varga handed it across. The message was concise. Policy 47B12 amended. 12th August beneficiaries H.P. Croft and D. Fairfax equal shares. Signed E.C. witnessed R. Hargreaves, solicitor. She returned it with a small nod. Mrs. Croft was a methodical woman. She would not alter a policy of such magnitude without discussion, yet no one here was told. Miss Fairfax retrieved her needles with trembling fingers. Evelyn was private about money. She said Harlan spent too freely. She wished to secure my future, nothing more. Your future, Varga repeated. £50,000 is a handsome security. The morning unfolded in a series of quiet detonations. Varga's men searched the guests' rooms with polite thoroughness. In Miss Fairfax's wardrobe, they found a damp bathing costume, navy wool, monogrammed DF, hidden beneath a pile of sensible undergarments. In the pocket, a single sapphire earring, its clasp broken. Miss Fairfax was taken to the library for private questioning. Through the closed door, her voice rose in shrill protest, then sank to a whimper. Mrs. Spence retired to her room with a migraine. Colonel Bantry polished his revolver and declared he would shoot the next policeman who touched his luggage. Miss Marple borrowed a pair of opera glasses from Mrs. Spence's boudoir and stationed herself on the upper terrace. The cove lay calm below, the sea a sheet of hammered bronze. She adjusted the focus and swept the rocks slowly. Something caught her eye, a flash of white among the oleanders halfway down the path. She descended the steps with care, her straw hat bobbing like a buoy. The white object was a lady's handkerchief, fine lawn, embroidered with a monogram. E.C. a smear of blood stained one corner. In the centre lay a small flat stone, its edge crusted with darker matter. She wrapped both in her own handkerchief and climbed back to the villa. Varga was in the hall, telephone receiver in hand. He replaced it as she approached. "Miss Fairfax admits to owning the bathing costume," he said, "claims she swam yesterday afternoon while Mrs. Croft napped. Cannot explain the earring." Miss Marple produced her finds. "The stone matches the wound, I think. And the handkerchief, Mrs. Croft's blood, perhaps her tears." Varga's eyes gleamed. "You have sharp eyes, madam." "Age sharpens some faculties," she replied. "It dulls others, but one learns to compensate." They were interrupted by the arrival of the police surgeon, a stout man with a moustache like a yard broom. He confirmed that the stone could indeed have caused the fracture, and that the blood on the handkerchief was human type O, Mrs. Croft's type, according to her American medical records. At noon, Lucian Gale was summoned. He entered the drawing room with the air of a man walking to the scaffold, sketchbook tucked beneath his arm. Varga wasted no time. "You were in the garden at dawn, Mr. Gale. You heard splashing, yet you did not see Mrs. Croft return." "I was sketching the light on the water," Gale said. "My back was to the path. Your cigarette butt was found beside the bathing cap. I smoke everywhere. Ask the servants." Varga opened the sketchbook and laid it on the table. The top drawing was Mrs. Croft in her sapphire necklace, alive, smiling, triumphant. The next page showed the same woman, throat encircled by the jewels now transformed into a hangman's rope. The third was blank. Gale stared at the drawings as though seeing them for the first time. "I told Miss Marple. Artistic fancy. All rehearsal," Varga said. Gale's laugh was hollow. "You think I killed her for £50,000? I haven't 50 pence to my name." "But you have debts," Varga countered. "Your London gallery advanced you 5,000 against future work. You have delivered nothing in 6 months." Gale's face crumpled. "I needed time. Evelyn promised to buy the portrait. 10,000. She changed her mind last week." Miss Marple spoke softly. She changed her mind because someone persuaded her the portrait was unflattering, someone who wished to damage your prospects. Gail looked at her wildly. Drusilla! She hated the way Evelyn flaunted the jewels, said it was vulgar. Miss Fairfax was brought in, pale and defiant. Confronted with the earring, the bathing costume, the altered policy, she crumbled. It was Harlan's idea, she cried. He said the insurance would pay double if Evelyn died abroad. We were to stage a theft, split the money, run away together. I struck her. She turned, laughed at me, called me a dried-up spinster. I lost my head. Croft was summoned. He denied everything at first. Then, faced with the telegram and Miss Fairfax's tearful accusation, collapsed. We were ruined, he muttered. Bad investments. Evelyn refused to sell the sapphires. Drusilla and we thought if the jewels vanished with her, the insurers would pay. I opened the safe after she left for her swim. Drusilla followed her down the path. And the ring? Varga asked. Croft's eyes slid away. Drusilla took it, said it would look like a robbery by natives. Miss Marple shook her head. A mistake. The ring was engraved inside, H to E forever. A thief would melt it down, not pawn it. Varga produced a small, velvet box. Inside lay the wedding ring, recovered that morning from a jeweller in Split. The engraver had noted the woman who sold it. Tall, beige dress, English accent. Miss Fairfax began to sob. Gail lit another cigarette with shaking fingers. Colonel Bantry muttered something about damned unsporting. That evening the arrests were made. Croft and Miss Fairfax were taken to the police station in Dubrovnik under heavy guard. The sapphires, earrings and brooch were found wrapped in oilskin inside the hollow leg of Miss Fairfax's knitting bag. The necklace remained on the dressing table, a cold blue coil. Mrs. Spence announced that the villa would be closed indefinitely. Colonel Bantry packed his revolver and booked passage on the next steamer to Trieste. Gail burned his sketchbook in the garden incinerator, watching the pages curl into black lace. Miss Marple sat on the terrace with her knitting, watching the sun sink into the sea. Inspector Varga joined her, offering a small glass of Slivovitz. You suspected the insurance from the first, he said. I suspected greed, she replied. It wears many faces, but the pattern was there. The necklace left behind, the ring taken, the bathing costume hidden too carelessly. Amateurs, Inspector, always amateurs. And the shell fragment? A red herring, I fear, from Anna's apron pocket. She had been gathering mussels for supper. Varga laughed, a rare sound. You are formidable, madame. I am merely old, Miss Marple said, and old women notice things. The young are too busy looking ahead to see what lies at their feet. The sea darkened to indigo. Somewhere a bell rang for vespers in the old town. Miss Marple finished her row, turned the heel of a sock, and thought of Mrs. Croft, who had worn her wealth like a crown and died beneath its weight. Tomorrow she would take the launch to the harbour, the train to Zagreb, the Orient Express home. The sapphires would return to a vault in London, the villa to silence. But the pattern, she reflected, the pattern of human folly, would repeat itself wherever pride and covetousness walked hand in hand. She packed away her needles, folded the sock, and went indoors to write a letter to her nephew Raymond. The sea whispered below, keeping its own counsel as it always had. Chapter 7. The Sapphire's Secret. The arrests of Harlan Croft and Drusilla Fairfax should have brought the affair to a tidy close. Yet Miss Marple, felt the same faint dissatisfaction she experienced when a skein of wool proved to have a hidden knot. The confessions were complete, the jewels recovered, the motive transparent. Still, something tugged at the edge of her mind like a loose thread. She spent the morning in the library, ostensibly reading a volume of Croatian poetry, but in truth reviewing her notebook. The entries were meticulous. Safe opened by Croft, admitted. Blows struck by Fairfax, admitted. Jewels concealed in knitting bag, found. Ring pawned in split, traced. Yet, why leave the necklace on the dressing table? Why tear only one earring? Why the motorboat at dawn? Inspector Varga had dismissed the boat as a blind. Croft's attempt to suggest an outside thief. The harbour master confirmed the vessel had returned by noon. Its occupant a local fisherman paid to cruise the bay and look suspicious. A clumsy diversion, but effective enough to muddy the waters for a morning. Miss Marple closed the book. Clumsy, yes, but not entirely. She rose and sought out Anna, whom she found in the laundry room pressing linen with a heavy iron. "Anna," she said in careful English, "the morning Madame died, did you see anyone on the back stairs before 7 o'clock?" Anna's eyes widened. "Yes, Signorina. The artist, Signor Gale. He came down with his box of paints very early. Said he wished to catch the sunrise on the rocks, but he went to the boathouse, not the garden." "The boathouse? See, there is a small door from the terrace. He stayed perhaps 20 minutes, then returned to his room. I thought nothing of it. Artists are strange." Miss Marple thanked her and climbed the back stairs to the upper corridor. Gale's room was at the far end, overlooking the boathouse roof. The door was locked, but the key hung on a nail outside, Mrs. Spence's trusting habit. She turned it softly and entered. The room smelled of turpentine and Turkish tobacco. An easel stood in the window. On it, a half-finished canvas of the cove at dawn, the sea a livid pink. Beneath the bed lay a leather portfolio. Miss Marple opened it with care. Inside were charcoal studies, Mrs. Croft in a dozen poses, some flattering, some cruel. One showed her standing on the zigzag path, sapphires blazing, her mouth open in a soundless scream. Another depicted the dolphin brooch alone, magnified, its diamond eye replaced by a drop of blood. At the bottom of the portfolio lay a folded sheet of heavy drawing paper. Miss Marple unfolded it. It was a detailed plan of the villa's ground floor, the safe marked with a cross, the path to the cove traced in red ink. In the margin, in Gale's spidery hand, she must wear them all. The light at 6:15 is perfect. She folded the plan and slipped it into her pocket. Downstairs, the telephone rang. Varga, confirming that Croft and Fairfax would be charged that afternoon. She replaced the portfolio exactly as she had found it and locked the door behind her. Lucian Gale was in the garden, burning the last of his sketches in a metal drum. The smoke rose in thin, acrid spirals. He looked up as she approached. "You've been busy, Miss Marple." "So have you, Mr. Gale." She held out the plan. This was not part of the confession. He glanced at it and laughed. Short, bitter. Insurance fraud is one thing, murder is another. I wanted the portrait commission, nothing more. When Evelyn refused, I thought the theft might force her hand. Drusilla overheard, twisted it to her own ends. You drew the map for her. I drew it for myself. Insurance, in case she changed her mind again. Drusilla stole it from my wastebasket. She and Croft were lovers, you know. Had been for months. Evelyn suspected, but could prove nothing. Miss Marple studied him. You knew the combination. Evelyn boasted of it one drunken evening. Birth dates, wedding day. Easy to remember. I never used it. Yet you went to the boathouse at dawn. To hide the map where Drusilla could find it later. Plant it on the fisherman. Complete the illusion. I am a coward, not a killer. Miss Marple folded the plan and returned it to her pocket. Cowardice has its own price, Mr. Gale. You might have prevented a death. He crushed the last sketch into the flames, and lost my freedom. I have debts, Miss Marple. Prison is a poor studio. She left him to the smoke and walked to the boathouse. The door was padlocked, but the window was open a hand's breadth. Inside, on a dusty shelf, lay a small oilskin packet. She reached through and drew it out. Inside, the second sapphire earring, its clasp intact, and a note in Drusilla Fairfax's angular hand. For LG, a token, burn this. Miss Marple wrapped the packet in her handkerchief and returned to the villa. Varga was in the hall, hat in hand. More bricks, Inspector, she said, and placed the packet on the table. He opened it, read the note, examined the earring. Fairfax intended to implicate Gale after all. A backup plan, Miss Marple said, in case Croft proved unreliable. Greed makes strange bedfellows. Varga smiled grimly. And the map. Mr. Gale's insurance policy against betrayal. He will testify, I think, in exchange for leniency. The inspector bowed. You have tied the knot, madame. Miss Marple picked up her knitting bag. Knots are my speciality, Inspector, though I prefer them in wool. That afternoon the police launch carried Croft and Fairfax away. Gale was taken for questioning, but released by evening. Witness, not accomplice. He stood on the jetty watching the boat disappear around the headland, then turned to Miss Marple. I am leaving tomorrow, he said. Vienna, perhaps. Somewhere the light is kinder. Take care of your debts, Mr. Gale, she replied. They have a way of following. Mrs. Spence announced that the villa would be sold. The sapphires returned to London by registered mail. The dolphin brooch, its diamond eye restored, gleamed coldly in its velvet case. Colonel Bantry departed for Trieste with his revolver and a bottle of plum brandy. Anna wept over the laundry. Miss Marple packed her small suitcase, adding the pink shell fragment as a souvenir. She would mount it in a paperweight for her nephew. On the dressing table she left a note for Mrs. Spence. Dear Arabella, the sea keeps its secrets, but people do not. Thank you for a most instructive visit. Ever, Jane? She descended to the launch at dawn. The water was glass calm, the sky a delicate pearl. As the boat pulled away, she looked back once. Sapphire shores stood golden against the cliffs, its terraces empty, its windows blind. The sapphires were gone, but their secret remained, etched in blood on a stone, hidden in a knitting bag, burned in a garden drum. The launch rounded the headland. Dubrovnik's bell tower rose rosy in the sunrise, and Miss Marple opened her knitting. 4 rows plain, 4 rows pearl. The pattern, she reflected, was always there if one looked closely enough. Chapter 8. The Receding Tide. The launch cut a straight silver line across the bay, leaving sapphire shores to dwindle into a postcard of pale gold and green. Miss Marple sat amidships, her suitcase at her feet, her knitting in her lap. The morning was flawless. The sea lay flat as a coin, the islands floated like scraps of violet silk, and the old town of Dubrovnik rose tier upon tier, its walls the colour of warm bread. A fisherman in a red cap lifted a hand in lazy salute. Gulls wheeled overhead, crying like children. She had said her farewells the previous evening. Mrs. Spence, hollow-eyed but resolute, had pressed a small icon into her hand. "For protection, Jane, though heaven knows you need none." Colonel Bantry had saluted stiffly and promised to write from Trieste. Lucian Gale had merely nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon as though already painting it in his mind. Inspector Varga had shaken her hand with formal courtesy and presented her with a tiny enamel badge of the Dubrovnik police, a souvenir, he said, of an English lady who saw further than most. The launch tied up at the harbour pier. A porter in a blue cap took her suitcase. The bus to the station waited, its engine ticking in the heat. She climbed aboard with the ease of long practice and settled by the window. The driver, a cheerful youth with a moustache like a broom, stowed her case and offered her a paper cone of roasted chestnuts. She accepted with a smile and a murmured "Vala." The road climbed through olive groves and past vineyards heavy with grapes. Below, the Adriatic glittered like a tray of sapphires, real ones this time, cold and indifferent. Miss Marple unwrapped her knitting. The sock was nearly finished, the heel turned, the decreases begun. She counted stitches under her breath, the needles clicking in steady rhythm. At the station she changed to the local train for Zagreb. The carriage was half empty. A priest reading his breviary, 2 nuns with market baskets, a young couple whispering over a map. She took a corner seat, placed her suitcase on the rack, and opened the Rubaiyat. The verses suited her mood, the moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on, nor all thy piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it. She thought of Mrs. Croft, who had trusted in jewels and found them a noose, of Harlan Croft, who had trusted in greed and found it a prison, of Drusilla Fairfax, who had trusted in passion and found it a trap, and of Lucian Gale, who had trusted in art and found it a mirror held to his own cowardice. The train lurched, gathered speed. Vineyards gave way to limestone hills, then to the broad plain of the Sava. At Zagreb she changed again, this time to the Orient Express, sleeker, more luxurious, bound for Venice, Paris, London. Her compartment was small but spotless. A fold-down basin, a reading lamp, a vase with 1 white rose. She unpacked her night things, hung her dressing gown on the hook, and sat by the window as the train slid northward through the dusk. Dinner was announced. She dined alone at a table laid with starched linen and heavy silver. Clear soup, trout in almond butter, a peach melba that dissolved on the tongue. The waiter, a grave Hungarian with impeccable manners, addressed her as Madame, and refilled her water glass without being asked. She ate slowly, watching the lights of villages flicker past like fireflies. Back in her compartment, she drew the curtains, turned down the bed, and took out her notebook one last time. She added a final entry in her neat slanting hand. Case closed. Motive, greed masked as love. Method, stone, sea, silence. Moral, jewels are cold comfort. Trust is warmer but rarer. She closed the book, slipped it into her handbag, and opened the window a crack. The night air rushed in, cool and pine-scented. Somewhere ahead lay Vienna, then the Channel, then home. She thought of her cottage, the lavender by the gate, the cat asleep on the sofa. She thought of Mrs. Spence selling Sapphire shawls, of Anna scrubbing floors in a new household, of Inspector Varga filing reports in a language she would never read. The train rocked gently. She turned off the lamp and lay down fully dressed, the blanket pulled to her chin. The rhythm of the wheels became a lullaby. Sapphire, sapphire, sapphire. she slept and dreamed of the sea, not the treacherous cove below the villa, but the gentle mill pond at home, where ducks paddled and willows trailed their fingers in the water. In the dream, Mrs. Croft stood on the bank, the sapphires gone, her throat bare. She smiled at Miss Marple and said, "You were right. The tide always reveals." Miss Marple woke at dawn to find the train crossing the lagoons of Venice, the city floating like a mirage on the pale water. She washed, dressed, and breakfasted on coffee and brioche. At Calais, the Channel steamer waited. The crossing was smooth, the sky a washed-out blue. Dover cliffs rose white and welcoming. The boat train to London was crowded with holiday-makers, but she found a seat and knitted steadily until the spires of Victoria Station appeared through the haze. A porter carried her suitcase. A taxi took her to the quiet street where her nephew's flat stood empty. He was abroad, and thence to the branch line for home. The village was unchanged. The post office, the vicarage, the duck pond, the war memorial. Her cottage gate creaked in welcome. The key turned sweetly in the lock. Inside, dust sheets shrouded the furniture, but the air smelled of lavender and beeswax. She opened windows, drew off the sheets, set a kettle to boil. The cat, borrowed from a neighbour, appeared on the sill tail high and permitted itself to be stroked. That evening she wrote letters. To Raymond, to Mrs. Spence, to Inspector Varga, a polite note of thanks with a pressed violet enclosed. She unpacked the pink shell fragment and set it on the mantelpiece beside a photograph of her sister. Then she took a fresh ball of wool, pale grey this time, and began a new pair of bedsocks. The church clock struck 9. She locked the doors, drew the curtains, and sat by the fire with a cup of cocoa. Outside, an owl called. The wind stirred the lavender. She thought of the Adriatic, glittering and treacherous, and of the quiet mill pond that reflected only truth. The sapphires were back in their vault, the murderers in their cells, the villa sold to a German industrialist who would fill it with jazz and champagne. But the pattern remained, woven into the fabric of human nature as surely as the cables in her knitting. Miss Marple finished her cocoa, rinsed the cup, and went upstairs. The bed was cool and familiar. The sheets smelled of sun and soap. She said her prayers, brief, grateful, and slept without dreaming. In the morning the postman brought a picture postcard. Dubrovnik at sunset, the walls glowing rose. On the back, in Varga's careful English, "The sea is calm. The case is closed. Thank you, madame. L.V." She propped it beside the shell fragment and smiled. Then she opened her front door to the September sunshine, took up her shopping basket, and walked to the village shop. The tide had receded. The shore was clean and life, quiet, orderly, and rich with small mysteries, waited to be knitted into its proper shape.